Now, look, I want to talk to you about something that's happening tomorrow in Muscat, Oman, something that most Americans might not be paying close attention to, but they should be. Because what happens in that room could determine whether we're heading toward peace and stability in the Middle East, or whether we're walking into one of the most dangerous confrontations this region has seen in decades. Tomorrow, representatives from the United States and Iran will sit down for nuclear talks. And I've got to tell you, having spent 8 years in the Oval Office dealing with nuclear threats from North Korea to Iraq to the challenges we faced in the former Soviet Union, I know the weight of these moments. I know what it means when diplomats gather to discuss uranium enrichment, missile programs, and the future of an entire region. These aren't just policy discussions. These are conversations that determine whether young Americans come home safely, whether families in Tehran and Tel Aviv can sleep peacefully at night, whether the global economy remains stable or spirals into chaos. Here's what concerns me. The way we're approaching this negotiation, the threats that have been issued, the military buildup in the Gulf, the public ultimatums, and we'll come back to that in a moment because those details matter enormously. I remember sitting in the White House working on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and understanding that diplomacy, real diplomacy, requires patience, credibility, and a genuine willingness to find common ground. It requires you to think not just about tomorrow's headlines, but about what kind of world we're leaving for the next generation. So as we watch what unfolds in Oman, we need to ask ourselves some hard questions about leadership, about strategy, and about whether this administration is truly committed to a diplomatic solution or whether we're watching something else entirely. Let me take you back, because you can't understand what's happening tomorrow without understanding how we got to this point. And the honest truth is, this crisis didn't have to happen. In 2015, President Obama, working with our European allies, China and Russia, negotiated what we call the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. Now, was it perfect? No. I've never seen a perfect agreement in my life. But here's what it did. It verifiably froze Iran's nuclear program. International inspectors had access. Iran's uranium stockpile was reduced by 98%. The pathways to a bomb were blocked. It was working. Then in 2018, President Trump withdrew from that agreement, even though Iran was in compliance. He reimposed what he called maximum pressure sanctions, crushing Iran's economy, devastating ordinary Iranian families, collapsing their currency. The idea was that economic pain would force Iran to capitulate on everything. Nuclear program, missiles, regional activities, you name it. But here's what actually happened. Iran started enriching uranium again, far beyond the limits of the original deal. Tensions escalated. Last June, and this is critical, the United States and Israel conducted military strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities after a 12-day Israeli bombing campaign. Iran retaliated with missiles and drones against Israel. We came frighteningly close to a regional war. Then, just last month, something else happened. Protests erupted across Iran over economic devastation and government repression. The Iranian regime cracked down violently. We're talking about hundreds, possibly thousands of deaths. President Trump threatened military intervention, deployed aircraft carriers and thousands of troops to the Gulf, and demanded Iran come to the negotiating table. And that brings us to tomorrow. Two sides, neither trusting the other, both under enormous domestic pressure, sitting down in Oman to discuss one of the most dangerous nuclear standoffs in the world. We've got to understand this isn't happening in a vacuum. All right, let's get down to brass tacks. What exactly are these two sides arguing about? Because the devil, as they say, is in the details. According to multiple sources, President Trump has laid out three core demands for Iran. First, zero uranium enrichment, meaning Iran would have to completely dismantle its enrichment program. Second, significant limits on Iran's ballistic missile arsenal. And third, an end to Iran's support for proxy groups across the Middle East, Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen. Now, Iran's position is very different. Tehran says these talks should focus exclusively on nuclear issues, period. Iranian officials have stated publicly that their missile program is off the table. They consider it a matter of national sovereignty, their right to defend themselves. They're willing to discuss uranium enrichment, but they want comprehensive sanctions relief in return. And here's the thing, Iran has about $120 billion in frozen assets around the world that they desperately need access to. But here's where it gets complicated. The Trump administration doesn't want to lift sanctions that would be politically costly, especially after Iran's brutal crackdown on protesters. Instead, they're floating what they call the Venezuela model. Remember how the U.S. recently took control of Venezuelan oil revenues, depositing them in custodial accounts in Qatar? They're suggesting something similar for Iran. The U.S. would control Iranian oil revenues without actually lifting sanctions. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said this week that if Iran wants to meet, the talks must be comprehensive nuclear issues, missiles, proxies, human rights, everything. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araqi responded that expanding the agenda beyond nuclear issues could jeopardize the entire negotiation. And here's what really worries me. These positions aren't just far apart, they're fundamentally incompatible. Trump is also sending his son-in-law Jared Kushner to these talks, along with Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. Meanwhile, there are U.S. aircraft carriers in the Arabian Sea, fighter jets on standby, and Trump himself told NBC News that Iran's supreme leader should be very worried. Now, this is where we need to talk about leadership, because the choices being made right now will determine whether we get a diplomatic breakthrough or a military disaster. Let me tell you something I learned in the White House. When you're trying to negotiate with an adversary, you need to give them a way to say yes. You need to create political space for their leadership to make concessions without looking weak to their own people. That's Diplomacy 101. But what's happening here? President Trump has spent weeks issuing public threats, deploying massive military force to the Gulf, and telling the world that Iran's supreme leader should be very worried. He's demanding zero uranium enrichment, which no Iranian leader, hardliner or moderate, could accept and survive politically. It's seen as surrendering their sovereign rights under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Here's my concern. These demands feel less like a serious negotiating position and more like a setup for failure. When you set preconditions you know the other side cannot accept, you're not really pursuing diplomacy, you're creating justification for military action. And let's talk about who's conducting these negotiations. Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, and Steve Witkoff, a real estate investor who's Trump's special envoy. Now, I'm not questioning their intelligence or their intentions, but nuclear diplomacy with a country of 90 million people requires deep expertise, institutional knowledge, and relationships built over years. Where are the career diplomats? Where are the regional experts from the State Department who spent their lives understanding Iranian politics and Middle Eastern security? Compare this to how we negotiated the original Iran deal. It took years. We had our best people, Secretary Kerry, Wendy Sherman, a whole team of technical experts. We worked with Britain, France, Germany, China, and Russia. We built consensus. We verified everything. I've got to be honest with you. Conducting high-stakes nuclear talks through military intimidation and family connections is not a recipe for success. It's a recipe for miscalculation. Now, let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention but matters enormously. America's credibility as a negotiating partner. And we got to remember that credibility is the foundation of all diplomacy. Here's the problem. In 2018, the United States unilaterally withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, even though Iran was in compliance, even though our European allies begged us not to, even though international inspectors confirmed the agreement was working. We gave our word, and then we walked away. What message does that send? It tells every country in the world that an agreement with the United States is only good until the next election, that our commitments aren't worth the paper they're written on if a new administration decides they don't like the deal. And that has real consequences. Right now, Iranian negotiators are sitting in Oman thinking, even if we make concessions, even if we sign an agreement, what guarantee do we have that it won't be torn up in 4 years? That's not paranoia, that's recent history. But the institutional damage goes deeper. When we bypass Congress, sideline career diplomats, and conduct foreign policy through military threats and personal envoys, we weaken the very institutions that have made American diplomacy effective for generations. The State Department, the intelligence community, the interagency process, these aren't bureaucratic obstacles. They're institutional safeguards that prevent catastrophic mistakes. And here's what really keeps me up at night. If these talks fail and we launch military strikes on Iran, we could destabilize the entire Gulf region. Oil prices would spike, harming American families and businesses. Iran would retaliate maybe against our forces, maybe against our allies. We could find ourselves in a regional war that makes Iraq look simple. American credibility isn't just about keeping promises. It's about demonstrating that we have the wisdom and restraint to use our enormous power responsibly. Let me tell you what I think is really going on here, because there's always a domestic political calculation in foreign policy decisions, and this one's got politics written all over it. President Trump wants a major foreign policy victory. I understand that every president does. A deal with Iran could be transformative, could potentially stabilize the Middle East, could be a legacy-defining achievement. But here's the question. Is he actually trying to reach an agreement, or is this political theater? Look at the math. Trump needs to satisfy the hawks in his own party who despise any engagement with Iran. So he can't offer meaningful sanctions relief that would look like weakness, like rewarding a regime that just killed protesters. But Iran won't make significant concessions without meaningful economic relief. Their economy is in free fall, their currency has collapsed, their people are suffering. So what's the solution? This Venezuela model they're floating, where the U.S. controls Iranian oil revenues in custodial accounts without actually lifting sanctions. Now think about what that means. We're asking Iran to give up its nuclear leverage in exchange for having America manage their money. That's not sanctions relief. That's financial occupation. No Iranian leader could accept that arrangement and survive. It would be seen as capitulation, as surrendering sovereignty to the very country that overthrew their government in 1953 and supported Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War. And this is where things start to get complicated. If Trump knows Iran can't accept these terms, then maybe that's the point. Maybe the goal is to say, we tried diplomacy, they refused our generous offer, and then proceed with military strikes with political cover. I hope I'm wrong about that. I truly do. But we've seen this playbook before. Impossible demands, public ultimatums, military buildup, and then the claim that we had no choice. Diplomacy requires both sides to have a genuine path to yes. So what actually happens after tomorrow? Let me walk you through the realistic scenarios, because Americans need to understand what we're facing. Scenario 1, the talks collapse. Iran refuses to discuss missiles and proxies. The U.S. refuses to offer meaningful sanctions relief. Trump, having deployed all this military force and issued all these threats, feels he has to follow through. We launch strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. Iran retaliates maybe against our ships in the Gulf, maybe against Saudi oil infrastructure, maybe against Israel. Suddenly we're in a regional war that could draw in multiple countries and put thousands of American service members at risk. Oil prices spike to $150, $200 a barrel. The global economy takes a massive hit. Scenario 2, they reach a narrow interim agreement. Iran agrees to some nuclear constraints, maybe capping enrichment at a certain level. The U.S. grants limited access to frozen assets through these custodial accounts, but missiles, proxies, human rights, all unresolved. It's basically kicking the can down the road, reducing immediate tension, but not addressing the fundamental issues. And without congressional approval or international buy-in, the agreement remains fragile. Scenario 3, both sides walk away without a deal, but agree to keep talking. The status quo continues, sanctions crushing Iran's economy, Iran slowly advancing its nuclear program, periodic military incidents, constant risk of escalation. It's not peace, but it's not war either. Here's what troubles me. None of these scenarios actually solve the underlying problems. Iran's regional ambitions, its domestic repression, the broader security architecture of the Middle East, these require sustained multilateral diplomacy. They require building coalitions with Europe, working with Gulf states, addressing Iran's legitimate security concerns while constraining its destabilizing activities. That's hard work. It takes years. It requires patience and credibility. And right now, I'm not seeing that kind of commitment. Let me close with this, because ultimately this is about what kind of country we want to be and what we should demand from our leaders. Nuclear diplomacy is too important, too consequential to be conducted recklessly. The decisions made tomorrow in Oman could determine whether American troops go to war, whether families in the Middle East live in peace or fear, whether the global economy remains stable or crashes. These aren't abstract policy questions, they're matters of life and death. So here's what we need to demand as citizens. Transparency from our government. We deserve to know what's being negotiated in our name. We need bipartisan congressional oversight, not just the president and his family making decisions behind closed doors. We need our career diplomats and regional experts at the table, not sidelined. And most importantly, we need a genuine commitment to diplomacy over military escalation. Now look, I'm not naive about Iran. Their government has committed serious human rights abuses. Their nuclear ambitions are a legitimate concern. Their support for proxies destabilizes the region. These are real problems that demand real solutions. But the best way to address those concerns isn't through threats and ultimatums. It's through patient, multilateral diplomacy backed by verification. It's what worked with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It's what produced the original Iran nuclear deal that was actually freezing their program. America is strongest when we build coalitions, when we honor our commitments, when we use our power wisely rather than impulsively. We're strongest when we give diplomacy every possible chance before we ever consider military action. If tomorrow's talks in Oman are conducted in good faith, with realistic expectations and genuine flexibility, they could be the first step toward de-escalation. But if they're just political theater designed to justify conflict, then every one of us needs to speak up because the stakes are simply too high for our children and grandchildren.